Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. I want to welcome back to the program Tyler Vasseur, shop steward with the National Association of Letter Carriers, Branch 9. Tyler, welcome back. I can't remember where we were in this process last time we spoke, but the first, to explain to everybody, will you just walk us through the different unions that exist if you are a postal worker?
Yeah, so first of all, Sam and Emma, thanks for having me back on. Last time I was on was International Workers' Day, May Day, so it's been a good 5 months. I'm a shop steward with the National Association of Letter Carriers. It represents over 200,000 working letter carriers. If you include retirees, it's about 280,000 members at the United States Postal Service. There's also the American Postal Workers Union, representing clerks, mechanics, janitors, and so on. Which is the second biggest. And then there's two more that are a little bit smaller. The Rural Carriers Union, they have their own union, and the Mail Handlers Union as well.
So you guys in the letter carriers, the National Association of Letter Carriers tend to be more urban oriented. Okay, so give us the history of the lack of contract you've had and what union leadership has done over the course of, I guess it's pretty close to 2 years now. A year and a half, at least, almost 2 years. A year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we went, our tentative agreement was announced on October, 18th? And that was after negotiations started in February of 2023. Our current contract expired in May of 2023. So it was over 500 days without a new contract. And the entire time, last time we talked, we were talking about the fight for open bargaining and contract campaign resolution that NALC members were fighting for going into our convention. It was to try to push back against that. The entire time leadership, the point of that resolution was we argued we needed two basic things: transparency, some sort of updates, and a real contract campaign, some sort of public fight. Two things that most unions do some form of.
Yep.
Because we were fighting against the closed door negotiations that our leadership of NALC on a national level was going with. We weren't told anything about negotiations basically the entire time.
And so October 18th rolls around, and this is in an environment where we have seen unions extract very large pay increases. When was the last time? So your contract ends in May 2023. When was the last time you guys got a raise? Like, how long was that contract in effect? Just to give people a sense of like how much letter carriers must have fallen behind relative to inflation. And we should say letter carriers were pretty important during COVID. I'm not sure people remember that, but and maybe they don't. Maybe even the leadership of the union doesn't remember. But give us a sense of like when the last time you guys got a raise was.
Yeah, so we still get, I always forget, is that every 10 or 11 months we get a step increase, and that's built into our contracts. You get a certain percentage just already, it's already negotiated for. And so those still happened during this contract while this contract was being negotiated. But it's based off of an old formula. It's based off of the contract that was settled last time. And so it doesn't reflect the new realities of inflation. We also get cost of living adjustments. This was something that was won by NALC members out of the fights in the 70s in their own inflationary times. But those cost of living adjustments, which happen, which are adjusted according to inflation, they're not one-to-one with inflation. So first of all, you don't get those when a contract's being negotiated. And second of all, our COLAs, our cost of living adjustments, are not one-to-one with inflation. They're a fraction. They're a formula based off of inflation. And then based on where you are in the steps, or where you are on the pay scale, you get a fraction of it. So those lower on the pay scale get a fraction of that fraction of inflation. And so basically what little increases we did get were based off of already built into the contract, based off of the last negotiated contract before this, all these rounds of inflation that hit us in post-COVID era. And we didn't get any cost of living adjustments. But there's a really interesting article that came out that was based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics that showed of all the jobs they looked at, postal workers have fared the worst over the last 10 years. From 2013 to 2023, they said inflation was 31%. Postal workers' wages went up 18%. So we've taken a pay cut in the last 10 years as postal workers, if you account for inflation.
Can you explain a little bit more about cost of living adjustments? Because that was a key thing that was won during the UAW strike, and just like how much of a difference that would make in terms of the contract that you're looking to agree to.
Yeah, so without getting into the weeds too much, like I was saying, our cost of living adjustments were something that a lot of unions had and fought for, especially in the 60s and 70s, as inflation was picking up in the post World War II era. In the 60s and 70s is when inflation really started picking up, especially in the late 70s. NALC won that in the 70s out of those battles, and that organizing. Basically, it's like, we use a formula based off of inflation to say, okay, you get an extra, amount of money on top of the general wage increase, the percentage wage increase.
So if inflation is, let's say, 4%, the real important figure is how much is your cost of living increase? You would think if inflation's 4%, the cost of living increase should be 4% because your cost of living has increased by 4%. Therefore, yours should be 4%. But under the existing contract, it's what, like you get half that, a quarter of that?
It's about a half. And that is for those at the top of the pay scale. It's lower down on the pay scale. You get a fraction of that half. And so I remember, just really quick, like on that point, I remember in 2022, I didn't know anything about how the COLAs worked. I was so excited. Everyone said, look at historic COLAs because inflation had been so high. I barely noticed a difference in my paycheck because I got a fraction of that percentage of inflation.
So the negotiations have been going on since February of 2023. And in October, they announced that the pay raise is going to be a whopping 1.3%.
That's right.
I mean, compare that to Boeing, right? Or compare like these recent contracts. What UPS even $7.50 an hour over 5 years. This is what 1.3% increases annually. Boeing 38% pay increases over 5 years in their contract. Like, this is egregious.
Yeah,
and then
I think you could make the case. You could make the case that 1.3%. They could make the case that 1.3% is fine if our COLAs were 1-to-1 with inflation, because that at least would get us ahead of inflation. But as it stands, our diet COLAs, that's what we call it, the diet COLAs that we currently receive, and the 1.3%, it amounts to a pay cut.
And Tyler, let me just correct you. It's not half, it's 0.4, which is retained in this contract. And again, that's the high end. And the only, I guess, like, it eliminates 3 early wage steps, which I guess in some ways lengthens the time that you get actually some type of wage step. I mean, it depends on how that, what the timing is. I don't have that information. And it shortens the progression to top pay. It's not going to take you 13 and a half years to get that 0.4 COLA. It's going to take you 11 and a half years to get to that 0.4 COLA. So after 11 and a half years, you will be able to keep up with inflation by less than half. And
something like that.
So, I mean, here's what's amazing to me. In July of 2023, the union could have said, okay, we're going to go into binding arbitration. Like, nobody looking at this would say, oh, okay, it makes sense that you are only, like, as inflation goes up, you only get compensated for less than half of it and no pay raise. Like, how much worse could have binding arbitration been than what the union is now pitching to you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons that the members are so angry. Well, first of all, just workers in this moment have heightened expectations. Inflation, I think, has been a driving force for workers to say, to sort of wake up and say, okay, what's going on here? We got to fight for more. I've got a union. This is what unions are for. Let's fight for wages to keep ahead of inflation. Then when on top of that, you can say that in the abstract, but then you're seeing the UAW, you're seeing Boeing workers, you're seeing the longshoremen win record wage increases that haven't been seen in decades. And so then workers I think that was a big reason why the 1.3% was such a slap in the face to letter carriers, because they saw that from other unions.
I'm curious, about how you convince your fellow letter carriers to vote against this contract.
Mhm.
And B, I'm curious how they have reacted to Donald Trump's election, because I could see people reacting like, we're lucky we have a job. Because, and I think, listen, if you're protected by the union, I don't know what Donald Trump's going to be able to do in terms of like cutting postal services. My guess is that they're going to do as much as they can. But I'm curious about how you argue about that, and what the reaction has been from your fellow letter carriers.
Yeah. So I was hoping you get into some of these questions. So there was initially outrage online. All you saw was vote no. There's a lot of momentum, but that's confined, like to Facebook, Reddit. That also was conversations happening on the workroom floor. I'm a part of a reform group called Build a Fighting NALC. I'm the chair of the coordinating committee, and that kind of came out of the fight for open bargaining. Now we're, really fully into the fight for vote no, fighting for the right to strike, these sorts of things. What we're trying to say is that we can't rely on that initial momentum and anger alone. You have to actually get organized for a no vote. And so we had a vote no campaign launch. We had over 700 people in attendance, all letter carriers, alongside other forces in the reform effort, Concerned Letter Carriers and Mike Cariff, two different groups that are running for the 2026 national leadership elections. And so what we're trying to do is we've been able to get or help people organize parking lot meetings and rallies, vote no group photos. NALC branches have passed vote no resolutions. I've counted roughly 60 group photos, and that's just the people who took pictures of people getting together saying, we can't just rely on momentum. We actually have to organize a no vote, hand out flyers, talk to people at these meetings, that sort of thing. And so I think that's the biggest thing. I don't think we want to put any illusions in arbitration. Arbitration was put in place after the 1970 Wildcat strike in order to prevent strikes from happening. They said, "Oh, no, you don't need the right to strike. We've got arbitration."
Right.
And our union has fared well in arbitration. I think it's made out ahead on most of those arbitrations. But ultimately, I think in BFN and Build a Fighting NALC, we're fighting for the right to strike, because this is exactly the type of moment that you would need the right to strike. That being said, in the moment, we're saying organize the strongest no vote possible. We want 75%. We want 80%. We want 90% no vote. So that when it does go to arbitration, that sends a strong message. And then combine that with the need for some sort of public actions, rallies, getting media attention, winning over the public. These sorts of positive pressure and leverage plays a role in arbitration. So we're not just saying put it to arbitration and hope for the best. We're saying put up a fight. In terms of Trump getting elected, the Postal Service and letter carrier job is very reflective of the broader U.S. society, the broader working class. I would say at least half of postal workers voted for Trump. And so on one hand, you have a lot of postal workers who are emboldened by that, said, all right, in their mind, they got their guy in, let's vote no and fight for more. There's lots of people,
right.
Lots of carriers who I know personally, who I'm friends with even, who voted for Trump and support a no vote and want to fight for more. On the other hand, there are letter carriers that are, I think rightfully so, fearful of what a Trump presidency poses for labor, for unions, for women, for Black people, and so because of all the potentials that could happen under a Trump presidency to attack living standards for working class people. And so we have an interesting role to play in trying to balance those things. I don't want to write off anyone's rightful fears. But we also don't want to alienate people who have in my opinion, have illusions in a Trump presidency and think that he's in there for working class people. I disagree with that.
Well, I guess they by voting no, they can test that theory out, and that's good.
Exactly. And just on that thing too, that's something that national leadership, I think they know this is a bad contract. They're not out there saying they're out there saying we can't tell you how to vote, that you have to make that decision, but then they hide behind fear mongering, and they fearmonger about postal finances, and they fearmonger about arbitration.
I wanted to ask you about that postal finances.
Mm-hmm.
There was an $11 billion investment in 1-year Treasury bonds, which I don't know, maybe that's a good idea or not. I'm not sophisticated enough to know, from a financial perspective, particularly of an entity that size, if it makes sense or not to tie up that. But it appears as if that was, it was basically put into the balance sheets to make it look like the Postal Service was running a bigger deficit than it is. And it's a 1-year investment. The Treasury bonds you're not going to lose any money off of that. And particularly with where inflation is now anyways, it's unlikely that, you're going to. So what's behind that? I mean, what do we have a sense of what the Postal Service's, I guess, operating deficit looks like? Mm-hmm. Because I know for a long time it was a function of a law that was passed during the Bush years where the Postal Service had to pre-fund 75 years out in advance the health care for people that presumably aren't even born yet, who become postal services. We should say is the only requirement that has ever existed for such a thing in public or private sector, probably maybe in the history of man and woman anywhere. And that was reversed in 2022 because it was just so outrageous. Mm-hmm. But where is the Postal Services, like, sort of, what are their finances looking like?
Yeah, so for that pre-funding mandate, first of all, it was the postal workers unions that fought to get that pre-funding mandate repealed. That was the beginning of when the Postal Service really hit financial problems. That took away a lot of the losses, but it didn't take away all of the losses. That being said, there's a really big sort of effort and momentum underway where people say, okay, well, open the books. Let's take a look. Where are you putting this money? And that's not just what you already have, what you already put out publicly, but let's really dive into them. There's also in the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act, 1970 or 71, whatever. It came out of the 1970 strike. It was when USPS became USPS. There's laws in there that saying that pay and benefits need to be comparable to the private sector. And it says that postal finances are not relevant to having to provide pay and benefits comparable to the private sector to the workers. And so if we bring it to arbitration, that should be the first thing you say. These postal finances should not matter. If our own union leadership is going to do the job of management and fearmonger about postal finances, I think we need to look at the fact that, okay, why are we getting any raises at all if they're losing all this money? Why did management get all these raises? Why did DeJoy himself? DeJoy
got like a 20% bonus on his pay, which is pretty. It's actually maybe 22% bonus. That's pretty good for an enterprise that is supposedly so strapped that they can't provide anything more than a 1.3% raise for its workers.
I think that if management cannot manage their own finances, then I think we really have to and maintain USPS as this quasi public-private entity. And we think that the Postal Service provides an important service to the public. As packages become more and more important, having a public postal service with universal service obligations and a relatively affordable service, it keeps prices down for Amazon, for UPS, for FedEx. If we think that is important and management can't manage their own finances, then I think we need to look in the fact that maybe the Postal Service should be publicly funded. I think that is these are the things that we should raise.
This is a good point, time to remind people. We do not pay for the Postal Service. The Postal Service pays for itself. Now, I think we had to provide loans at one point, again, because of that pre-funding mandate. But the Postal Service is self-supporting. And in some ways, like you mentioned, it's a subsidy for Amazon and UPS. They basically hitch a ride on the back of the infrastructure that the Postal Service has provided. Mm-hmm. But they don't have the universal obligations, or A, they don't have the universal obligations. B, to the extent that they do provide close to universal service, it comes at a very, very high price relative to the Postal Service. So in some ways, like, this is, and again, like you say, the finances of the Postal Service is pretty opaque, but from the outside, with a guy like Louis DeJoy and this movement to sort of have the Postal Service provide, it's almost like providing the roads in terms of a logistics question for other companies. In this case, it's roads, and often it's the last mile, and often it's the skies. It looks like real classic neoliberalism. And I'm talking the kind that came out of like Mont Pelerin, where it's basically, we're going to use government to enrich industry in many ways, and it's going to come at the expense of those people who are actually working for this enterprise.
Yeah. Amazon would not have been able to grow at the rate and the speed and the intensity that it has grown at over the last decade without the Postal Service. When I started in 2018, it was USPS delivered around 50%. I think it was just under 50% of all Amazon packages. That was when I started in 2018. I'm sure it's lower now. Amazon is starting their own deliveries, whatever else. But without the USPS, Amazon would not have been able to grow. And like you said, it's a subsidy for private corporations to be able to grow. And then now they're looking now and then turn around and say, and look at how useless the Postal Service is. They can't even manage their own.
But that's what DeJoy wanted, right? I mean, isn't that always really what his mandate was? Like, he came from the private sector, and that was what we anticipated when Trump appointed him. And so I guess my question is we went over it a little earlier, but like, what was the reaction within other postal workers to DeJoy's tenure continuing under Biden? And like, did that contribute to some of what you were saying about some of the discontent and the split among other members of the union?
Yeah, so I mean, DeJoy was implemented. So Trump appoints the Postal Board of Governor members, who then appoint the Postmaster General. But so essentially, Trump appointed DeJoy back under his first term. That was right after the Trump administration commissioned a study that looked into the Postal Service and said, what do we do about the Postal Service? That study came back and said, privatize the Postal Service. Then they turned around and appointed DeJoy. And DeJoy is putting in, his 10-year plan to ultimately close down neighborhood post offices in favor of mega centers out in the suburbs like UPS, like FedEx, like Amazon have, and basically trying to mimic the private industry when, again, it's the United States Postal Service. If you close down every neighborhood post office, then guess what? People aren't going to drive out to the suburbs. And if you live in a city, aren't going to drive out to the suburbs to go to the post office. They're just going to go to the UPS store down the street. And that's what we're, ultimately, I think it's a veiled attempt to set up the infrastructure for privatization without openly saying the P word out loud.
So, so Tyler, if I'm a letter carrier, I'm a member of this union, and I'm listening to you right now, or I'm a member of the public, which I happen to be, and am supportive of letter carriers getting better pay, what should I do in both those circumstances?
Yeah, so if you are a letter carrier, I would say get involved in the Vote No campaign first and foremost.
How do they do that?
I can plug in a meeting here in a second, but ultimately, I think you should join Bill to Fighting NALC, the reform effort that is getting organized. Since we've launched the Vote No campaign in our website, hundreds and hundreds of letter carriers across the country have joined, saying, I want to join joined online, saying, I want to join BFN. I want to start a chapter in my area. We're starting to build chapters across the country. We want to launch officially as a rank and file reform caucus. We're fighting for we're fighting for a vote no to fight for more in this contract. We're fighting for the right to strike. We're fighting to transform this union. We had our launch campaign a couple weeks ago, but a good place to plug in. So first of all, you can go to fightingnalc.com. Bill the Fighting NALC domain was taken. Whoever has that, we want it back, but go to fightingnalc.com. Click there you can sign up there to join. We're fighting for things like a $30 an hour starting wage, top pay comparable to UPS, ending mandatory overtime, 100% COLAs, not diet COLAs, an all career workforce, and the right to strike. a good place to, we're sort of a rank and file reform effort trying to get organized on the shop floors amongst the rank and file, but there are other forces in the reform effort, especially slates that are being formed to run for leadership specifically. An important one is CLC, the Concerned Letter Carriers. They're holding a meeting this Sunday at 3 p.m., November 24th at 3 p.m. Central Time. You can find that Zoom link. I can send it to you all if you'd be able to post that to register for that meeting. That'd be a great place to plug in and to be able to join the Vote No campaign for the home stretch. But ultimately, I would say get involved with BFN. If you agree with these things, if you want to fight for the right to strike, join us and help start a chapter in your area where we're getting organized on a much more serious basis along those lines.
Send us that link. We'll post it in the podcast and YouTube descriptions and at majority.fm. And for those of us who are not members of your union, what should we do?
Ultimately, what we've been arguing for is we're going to vote this thing down by the widest margin we can, and then we're going to, before it goes to arbitration, we want to do public rallies. We want to get out there. And so I would just say pay attention. There's very likely going to be a rally in your area. Join that rally. Get involved in that way. And I'm sure there'll be more calls to action and calls for solidarity coming out of that. And
thank your local postal carrier. Tell them you stand with them, and if they go on strike, if they reject this contract, you're gonna support them, and tell your friends that they should support them as well. Tyler Vasseur, thanks so much for your time. Like I say, we'll put all those links in the podcast and YouTube description. Shop Steward, National Association Letter Carriers, Branch 9. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.